The 9th of August 1945. The Philippine island of Luzon lay heavy under the tropical sun, the air thick with humidity that made breathing feel like drowning. In a temporary holding facility outside Manila, a Japanese soldier sat on a wooden bench beneath the corrugated metal roof of what the Americans called a mess hall. He was 24 years old, though he looked older, his face weathered by 3 years in the South Pacific, his body reduced to sinew and bone by malnutrition and dysentery. His uniform, once the proud khaki of the Imperial Japanese Army, hung on him like a burial shroud, stained with mud and salt and the residue of battles he had survived but could not forget. Before him, on a metal tray, sat food. Not the watery rice gruel he had subsisted on for months. Not the pickled radish and seaweed that had constituted a feast during the final, desperate weeks on Luzon. Not the bark and grass and, when desperation became absolute, the unspeakable things men ate when starvation erased the boundaries of civilization. This was American food. Mashed potatoes with gravy, a thick slice of meatloaf, green beans, white bread with butter, canned peaches in syrup, and a cup of coffee that steamed in the oppressive heat. The soldier stared at the tray as though it were an hallucination. His hands, skeletal and trembling, hovered over the food, but did not touch it. Around him, other Japanese prisoners exhibited similar paralysis, some weeping openly, others sitting in stunned silence, a few laughing with the brittle sound of men whose minds had fractured under the weight of cognitive dissonance. One prisoner, a sergeant who had fought at Bataan and survived the subsequent guerrilla campaign in the mountains, simply fainted, his body collapsing sideways off the bench before American medics rushed to revive him. The soldier finally picked up the fork, an implement he had not used in years, so accustomed had he become to eating with his hands or chopsticks scavenged from abandoned villages. He pierced a piece of meatloaf. He lifted it to his mouth. He chewed slowly, mechanically, his face expressionless. And then, as the taste registered salt, fat, protein, flavors his body had forgotten existed, he began to sob. Not quietly, not with dignity. He sobbed with the raw, uncontrolled anguish of a man confronting the absolute collapse of everything he had believed about the war, about the enemy, and about his own nation's capacity to endure. What destroyed him was not defeat. It was not captivity, nor even the knowledge that the emperor had surrendered and Japan had lost. What shattered him was the food itself, the impossible, obscene abundance of it, the casual generosity with which it was served, the undeniable material fact that America had so much that it could feed its prisoners better than the Imperial Japanese Army had fed its own soldiers. In that moment, with the taste of meatloaf on his tongue, he understood with terrible clarity that Japan had never had a chance. To comprehend the psychological devastation wrought by an American mess hall meal, one must first understand what food meant in the Imperial Japanese military, not as sustenance, but as a test of spirit, a measure of devotion, and ultimately, a weapon wielded against its own soldiers. The Japanese soldiers' daily ration, even in the early years of the war when supply lines were intact and victory seemed assured, was meager by Western standards. The basic field ration consisted of rice approximately 850 grams per day when available, supplemented by small amounts of pickled vegetables, dried fish, miso paste, and occasionally, canned goods. There was no fresh meat. There were no dairy products. Fruits and vegetables beyond the pickled radish and occasional onion were luxuries reserved for officers or special occasions. The caloric content, when the full ration was issued, hovered around 2,500 calories, sufficient for a man at rest, inadequate for a soldier engaged in combat operations in tropical heat. But the full ration was rarely issued. As the war progressed and Japan's merchant fleet was decimated by American submarines, as supply convoys were sunk in the waters between the home islands and the far-flung garrisons scattered across the Pacific, the rations diminished. By 1943, soldiers in New Guinea and the Solomon Islands were receiving half rations. By 1944, in places like the Philippines and Burma, They were receiving quarter rations or less. By 1945, in the bypassed islands where Japanese garrisons had been cut off and left to starve, they were receiving nothing at all. The Imperial General Headquarters had a phrase for this: living off the land. It was a euphemism that translated, in practice, to foraging, theft, and starvation. Soldiers were expected to supplement their rations by hunting, fishing, and gathering wild plants. In reality, most Japanese soldiers had no training in jungle survival. They did not know which plants were edible and which were poisonous. They did not know how to trap game or fish effectively. They learned through trial and error, and the errors killed them slowly, through malnutrition and disease, or quickly, through toxic plants that induced seizures and respiratory failure. On Guadalcanal, where the Japanese garrison fought for 6 months before being evacuated in February 1943, an estimated 15,000 Japanese soldiers died. Of these, only 5,000 were killed in combat. The remaining 10,000 died of starvation and disease, malaria, dysentery, beriberi, and dengue fever, all exacerbated by malnutrition so severe that men's bodies consumed themselves. They called Guadalcanal Starvation Island, and the name spread through the Japanese military like a curse, a warning of what awaited those sent to fight in the Pacific. The soldier sitting in that Manila mess hall had been on Luzon during the final year of the war, when the Japanese position in the Philippines had become untenable and the Imperial Army had retreated into the mountains to wage a guerrilla campaign it could not win. His unit had been cut off from supply for 7 months. The daily rice ration had dwindled from 850 grams to 400 grams to 200 grams to nothing. They had eaten the mules and horses first, then the unit mascot dog, then the rats they could catch in the field camps. They had stripped bark from trees and boiled it into a paste that provided fiber, but no nutrition. They had dug for roots and grubs. And when all else failed, they had simply starved, lying in makeshift shelters in the jungle, too weak to move, waiting for death or rescue that never came. He had watched men die. Not violently, not heroically, but slowly, their bodies wasting until they were skeletal, their skin stretched over bones, their eyes sunk deep into their skulls, their minds wandering between lucidity and delirium. Some had spoken of home, of meals their mothers had prepared, of rice and fish, and the small comforts of civilian life. Others had simply stopped speaking, retreating into a silence that preceded death by hours or days. The survivor's guilt he carried was not for those who had died in battle, but for those who had died of hunger. Their bodies discarded in shallow graves because there was no strength left to bury them properly. And now he sat before a tray of food that contained more calories than he had consumed in a week, served by an enemy that had defeated him so thoroughly that it could afford to feed him as though he were not an enemy at all, but simply a man who needed a meal. The contrast was not accidental. It was policy, born of American abundance and codified in military doctrine, that reflected a fundamentally different understanding of warfare, logistics, and human dignity. The United States military, from the moment it began mobilizing for World War II, operated under the assumption that soldiers fought better when they were well fed. This was not sentimentality. It was pragmatism informed by industrial capacity. The American economy, even while supporting a two-front war across 2 oceans, produced agricultural surplus on a scale that defied comprehension. In 1943, the United States harvested 2.8 billion bushels of wheat, enough to feed not only the American population and military, but also significant portions of Allied forces in Europe, Asia, and the Pacific. Meat production exceeded domestic consumption by millions of tons annually. The surplus distributed through Lend-Lease programs and military supply chains. The standard American field ration, whether the C ration for frontline troops or the more varied B ration for rear echelon units, provided between 3,200 and 4,000 calories per day. Each ration included meat, canned beef, pork, or chicken, along with vegetables, bread, or crackers, butter, jam, sugar, coffee, chocolate, and cigarettes. The variety was deliberate, designed to maintain morale by preventing the monotony that eroded fighting spirit. Nutritionists worked with the Quartermaster Corps to ensure that soldiers received not just calories, but balanced nutrition: proteins, fats, carbohydrates, vitamins, and minerals in proportions calculated to sustain physical performance and mental acuity. The logistics required to deliver these rations were staggering. Every American soldier in the Pacific Theater consumed approximately 4 pounds of food per day. Multiply this by the hundreds of thousands of troops deployed across islands, spanning thousands of miles, and the scale becomes apparent. Supply ships crossed the Pacific in continuous convoys, their holds filled with crates of rations, each crate packed and labeled with industrial precision. Refrigeration ships carried fresh meat and dairy products when possible. Mobile bakeries produced fresh bread near the front lines. Field kitchens, equipped with portable stoves and trained cooks, prepared hot meals even in combat zones, because the American military believed that a hot meal was worth the logistical effort if it maintained morale. And when Japanese soldiers surrendered those who survived to surrender, who had not died of starvation or disease, or been killed in the fanatical Banzai charges, their officers ordered, they were processed through the same logistical apparatus that fed American troops, not with reduced rations, not with punishment meals designed to humiliate, but with the same B rations served in mess halls throughout the Pacific. This was not mercy, though it appeared that way to men who had been starving. It was policy, dictated by the Geneva Conventions, and enabled by the simple fact that America had enough food that the marginal cost of feeding prisoners was negligible. The Japanese soldier had been taught to expect something very different. The Imperial Japanese Army's doctrine regarding prisoners of war was shaped by a cultural and military ethos that viewed surrender as the ultimate dishonor. The Code of Bushido, as interpreted and weaponized by the militarist regime, held that a soldier's duty was to fight to the death or, failing that, to commit suicide rather than face the shame of capture. To be taken prisoner was to cease being Japanese, to become something less than human, a non-person whose family would be disgraced, whose name would be struck from records, whose existence would be denied. This ideology had practical consequences. Japanese soldiers were not trained in how to behave if captured, because capture was not contemplated as a possibility. They were not taught the protections theoretically afforded by the Geneva Conventions because Japan, while a signatory, had never ratified the treaty and did not consider itself bound by its provisions. They were instead indoctrinated with stories of American brutality, tales of prisoners tortured, mutilated, and executed, of savage Marines who took no prisoners and collected gold teeth and skulls as trophies. Some of these stories had a basis in fact. War crimes occurred on both sides, and the Pacific Theater, with its island-by-island brutality and the racial hatreds both nations cultivated, produced atrocities that would haunt veterans for decades. But the systematic narrative of American savagery served a purpose beyond truth. It ensured that Japanese soldiers would fight to the death rather than surrender, because surrender meant not just dishonor, but torture and execution at the hands of barbarians. And yet, when the soldier had finally surrendered, when his unit had been surrounded and out of ammunition and reduced to fewer than 30 men out of an original 200, when the American loudspeakers had broadcast messages in Japanese promising safety and food, when the alternative to surrender was death by slow starvation, he had expected to die. He had expected beatings, interrogations under torture, a bullet to the head or a knife to the throat. He had steeled himself for this, reciting prayers to ancestors and emperor, trying to find some scrap of dignity in the inevitable. Instead, American soldiers had searched him for weapons, given him water, and directed him to a truck that transported him and other prisoners to the holding facility outside Manila. There had been no beatings, no torture. The American guards were bored, indifferent, some of them friendly in a casual way that was more disturbing than hostility would have been. They treated the Japanese prisoners not as hated enemies but as a logistical problem to be processed, documented, photographed, interrogated by intelligence officers who spoke polite Japanese and asked questions about unit strength and morale. And then they had fed him. Not prisoner rations, not starvation rations, but the same food American soldiers ate. This, more than anything else, broke the narrative. If the Americans were barbaric savages, why did they waste food on prisoners? If the Americans were desperate and weak, why did they have so much that they could afford generosity? The cognitive dissonance was paralyzing, a fundamental contradiction between ideology and reality that could not be reconciled. The mess hall itself was a marvel, though the soldier lacked the frame of reference to fully appreciate it. It was a temporary structure, erected in a matter of days by Seabees, the Navy construction battalions, whose efficiency in building infrastructure had become legendary. The roof was corrugated metal, supported by steel frames. The floor was concrete, poured and leveled, to prevent mud and standing water. Long tables with attached benches ran the length of the hall, providing seating for hundreds. At one end, a serving line stretched behind stainless steel counters where American cooks, most of them draftees from civilian life, ladled food onto trays with the mechanical efficiency of men who had served thousands of meals and would serve thousands more. The kitchen behind the serving line contained equipment that would have seemed fantastical to the Japanese soldier had he been allowed to see it. Industrial stoves, refrigeration units, powered by diesel generators, dishwashing stations with hot running water, storage facilities organized with the precision of a factory floor. The Americans had mechanized even this, turning the feeding of an army into an industrial process that bore little resemblance to the field kitchens of other militaries, where cooks boiled rice in steel pots over wood fires and hoped the food did not spoil before it reached the troops. The soldier noticed details without understanding their significance. The American guards ate at the same tables as the prisoners, not separated by rank or nationality, but simply sitting where there was space. The guards' trays held the same food as the prisoners' trays. There was no visible hierarchy of rations, no privileged officers' mess where better food was reserved for those of higher rank. This was profoundly alien to a military culture where officers ate separately and often significantly better than enlisted men, where rank determined not just authority, but access to food, shelter, and every other resource. He watched an American private, a boy no older than 19, with red hair and freckles, return to the serving line for a second helping of mashed potatoes. The cook gave it to him without hesitation, without question, simply scooping more food onto the tray. Second helpings. The concept was almost incomprehensible. In the Imperial Army, a soldier who requested more food would be denied, or worse, disciplined for gluttony and lack of spiritual discipline. Food was allocated according to rank and need was always less than hunger. The soldier looked down at his own tray, at the food he had barely touched because his stomach, shrunken from months of starvation, could not process more than a few bites without cramping. The meatloaf alone, a single slice, perhaps 4 ounces of ground beef, mixed with breadcrumbs and spices, represented more meat than he had eaten in 6 months. The mashed potatoes, rich with butter and milk, contained dairy products he had not tasted since before the war. The green beans, while canned and therefore not fresh, were vegetables beyond the pickled radish that had been the sole vegetable in his diet for years. The bread, soft and white, was a luxury his family could not have afforded even in peacetime, and the peaches canned in heavy syrup, each slice glistening with sugar, were a dessert so extravagant that it seemed obscene, a waste of resources that should have been reserved for what? For whom? That was the question that broke him. If America could give its prisoners canned peaches in heavy syrup, what did that say about American abundance? What did it say about Japan's chances of victory? The interrogation had come before the meal, conducted in a plain room with a table and 3 chairs. The American intelligence officer was a Nisei, a second-generation Japanese-American whose family had been interned in California while he served his country in uniform. He spoke Tokyo Standard Japanese, with the slight American accent of someone who had learned the language at home, but lived his life in English. He asked questions about the soldiers' unit, about morale, about the conditions on Luzon during the final months. the soldier answered honestly. There was no point in lying. The war was over. The emperor had surrendered. Whatever intelligence he possessed was already obsolete. The officer's demeanor was professional, almost sympathetic. He offered the soldier a cigarette, an American cigarette. A lucky strike. Not the harsh Japanese tobacco that burned the throat. He asked if the soldier needed medical attention. He explained, in careful Japanese, that the soldier would be held in a POW camp until arrangements could be made for repatriation, that conditions in the camp would be safe and humane, that there would be food and medical care and shelter. Why? The soldier asked, the first question he had volunteered. Why do you do this? The officer seemed puzzled. Do what? Feed us. Give us cigarettes. Treat us. The soldier struggled for the word. Treat us like this. The officer considered the question for a long moment. Because you're prisoners of war? He said finally. The war is over for you. You're not a threat. There's no reason to treat you badly. But we are your enemies. You were our enemies, the officer corrected. Now you're just men who lost a war, and we have enough food, so we feed you. The simplicity of the answer was devastating. We have enough food, so we feed you, as though it were the most natural thing in the world, as though generosity were not a sacrifice but simply the logical consequence of abundance. The soldier wanted to argue, to insist that it could not be so simple, that there must be some deeper motive propaganda, perhaps, or a strategy to break the will of prisoners and turn them into collaborators. But he had seen the American guards eating the same food. He had seen the casual waste plates scraped into trash bins because the portions were too large. Food thrown away because a soldier did not like green beans or wanted only the meatloaf and bread. He had seen abundance so complete that waste was inevitable, because even waste was affordable. In the mess hall, the soldier forced himself to eat. His stomach protested after a few bites, cramping painfully, but he continued because stopping felt like surrender to a different kind of defeat. The acknowledgement that his body had been so damaged by starvation that it could no longer process real food. Around him, other prisoners faced similar struggles. Some vomited almost immediately, their systems unable to handle fats and proteins after months of near-total deprivation. American medics moved through the hall, monitoring the prisoners, pulling aside those who showed signs of refeeding syndrome, the dangerous metabolic disturbances that could kill a starving man as surely as the starvation itself. One medic, a corpsman from Nebraska who had seen enough emaciated prisoners to recognize the warning signs, knelt beside the soldier and spoke in halting Japanese. Slow. Eat slow. Small bites. Your stomach needs time. The soldier nodded, tears streaming down his face, humiliated by his body's weakness, by the medic's kindness, by the entire impossible situation. The medic patted his shoulder, a gesture of comfort between men, not enemies, and moved on to check another prisoner. The soldier ate slowly, taking small bites of mashed potato, letting each one dissolve in his mouth before swallowing. The taste was overwhelming, almost painful in its richness. His body, starved for so long, responded with a rush of sensations, pleasure and nausea intertwined, hunger and satiation at war with each other. He thought of his mother, who had worked in a textile factory in Osaka, and sent him letters filled with descriptions of meals she could not afford to cook. Imaginary feasts meant to comfort a son she knew was hungry. He thought of the men in his unit who had died of starvation, who would never taste food like this, who had died believing they were fighting for a nation that could not even feed its soldiers. The symbolism was inescapable. The meal was not just food, it was a demonstration of power, more effective than any weapon. The Americans had not defeated Japan by killing every soldier, though they had killed millions. They had defeated Japan by simply outlasting it, by maintaining supply lines Japan could never match, by feeding their troops and their prisoners while the Imperial Army starved. The mathematics of it were brutal and undeniable. A well-fed soldier could fight. A starving soldier could not. America, had well-fed soldiers. Japan had soldiers who foraged for grass and ate their own dead. The emperor had spoken of enduring the unendurable in his surrender broadcast. But the unendurable, the soldier now understood, was not defeat in battle. It was this sitting in an enemy mess hall, eating better than he had eaten in years, confronting the material fact that Japan had lost before the first shot was fired, because Japan had never possessed the resources to win. The POW camp where the soldier would spend the next 4 months was located on Leyte, another Philippine island where the Americans had constructed a sprawling complex of barracks, administrative buildings, medical facilities, and recreational areas. The camp held more than 8,000 Japanese prisoners, men from every branch of the Imperial Military Army, Navy, aviation, support units. They came from across the Pacific, the Philippines, New Guinea, the Marianas, Okinawa. Some had surrendered voluntarily. Others had been captured while wounded or unconscious. A few had been forcibly prevented from committing suicide by American soldiers who did not understand or did not care about the code of Bushido. Life in the camp was regimented, but not harsh. Roll calls twice daily. Work details for those deemed fit enough. Clearing debris, unloading supplies, assisting with construction, medical examinations and treatment for the diseases and injuries that afflicted nearly every prisoner. And meals. 3 meals a day, served in mess halls identical to the one outside Manila, prepared by American cooks who seemed baffled by the prisoners' awe at food the cooks considered routine. The soldier gained weight slowly. His body, damaged by prolonged malnutrition, took weeks to adjust to regular meals. He suffered digestive problems, cramping and diarrhea, as his system learned to process fats and proteins again. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, he began to resemble the man he had been before the war. Still thin, but no longer skeletal. His eyes clearer. His movements steadier. Other prisoners experienced similar transformations, physical and psychological. The camp became a strange, liminal space, a community of defeated men waiting for a future none of them could imagine. They were not allowed newspapers or radios. The Americans feared that news from Japan might trigger unrest or suicide attempts. They were not told when they would be repatriated or what awaited them at home. They existed in a suspended present, fed and housed and kept alive by an enemy that had no reason to care for them beyond the dictates of international law and the affordability of kindness. Some prisoners adapted quickly, learning English phrases, volunteering for work details, befriending the American guards who treated them with casual informality. Others retreated into silence, spending their days sitting in the barracks, staring at nothing, unable or unwilling to process the cognitive dissonance of their situation. A few attempted suicide, overcome by shame at having survived when death would have been honorable. The Americans, when they discovered these attempts, responded with medical intervention and psychiatric evaluation, applying Western concepts of mental health to men whose distress was cultural and existential. The soldier fell somewhere between adaptation and paralysis. He learned a few English words: thank you, water, yes, no, enough to navigate the camp, but not enough for real communication. He worked when assigned work, moving through the tasks mechanically, his mind elsewhere. And he ate, 3 times a day, meals that continued to astonish him with their abundance and variety. Breakfast was oatmeal or scrambled eggs with toast and jam, coffee with milk and sugar. Lunch was soup and sandwiches, sometimes with fruit. Dinner was the largest meal: meat, potatoes, or rice, vegetables, bread, dessert, coffee. The portions were generous, larger than most prisoners could finish, and the surplus was thrown away. The waste haunted the soldier. He watched American guards scrape half-eaten meals into trash barrels and felt something like rage, or grief, or incomprehension. In Japan, every grain of rice was precious, saved and reused, never wasted. Here, waste was so normalized that no one even noticed it. The American guards were an enigma. They were not cruel, but neither were they particularly kind. They were simply present, doing a job that bored them, counting the days until they could go home. Most were draftees, young men from farms and cities who had been pulled from civilian life and thrust into a war they had not chosen. They played cards during their shifts, smoked cigarettes, complained about the heat and the boredom and the army in general. They treated the Japanese prisoners with the same indifferent professionalism they would have shown to any logistical challenge, not with hatred, not with respect, but with the casual competence of men who had a job to do and wanted to do it with minimal effort. Some guards were friendly, offering cigarettes or showing pictures of girlfriends and families back home. Others were coldly professional, maintaining distance and refusing any interaction beyond the necessary. A few were openly hostile, men who had lost friends or brothers in the Pacific and viewed every Japanese prisoner as complicit in those deaths. But even the hostile ones did not abuse the prisoners. The army had rules, and the rules were enforced. A guard who struck a prisoner or withheld food or engaged in any form of mistreatment faced court-martial. This, too, was alien to the soldiers' experience. In the Imperial Army, discipline was maintained through violence beatings for minor infractions, executions for major ones, a culture of brutality that flowed from officers to enlisted men and from senior soldiers to new recruits. The American military had its own hierarchies and punishments, but the casual violence that permeated the Japanese system was absent. American soldiers complained about their officers, mocked them behind their backs, grumbled about orders, but followed them anyway. The relationship between ranks was based on law and regulation, not fear. One day, while on a work detail moving crates in a warehouse, the soldier witnessed an American private arguing with a sergeant. The private's tone was disrespectful, bordering on insubordinate. The sergeant responded by dressing down the private verbally, loudly, and with profanity, but without physical violence. The private was assigned extra duty as punishment. That was all. No beating, no public humiliation, no ritual slapping that would have been routine in the Imperial Army. The soldier mentioned this to another prisoner, a former corporal who had survived Guadalcanal. "They don't hit each other," the soldier said, confused. "They don't need to," the corporal replied. "They have enough food, enough equipment, enough of everything. Men fight over scraps. When there are no scraps, there's less to fight about." The observation was simple but profound. Abundance reduced conflict. Scarcity bred violence. Japan had gone to war to secure resources it lacked, and in doing so, had created a military culture built on scarcity, where every soldier competed with every other soldier for the insufficient rations and supplies that were never enough. America, possessing abundance, had built a military culture where competition was unnecessary because there was enough for everyone. News of the atomic bombs reached the camp through rumors, whispers among prisoners who had gleaned fragments of information from guards or overheard conversations. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, cities destroyed in an instant. Hundreds of thousands dead. The numbers were so large they became abstract, incomprehensible. The soldier tried to imagine what a bomb that destroyed an entire city would look like, and failed. He had seen conventional bombing the B-29 raids that had incinerated Tokyo and Osaka, the firebombing that had killed more in a single night than the worst battles of the war. But a single bomb? Bomb, one city. It was impossible. It had to be propaganda. But the emperor had surrendered. That was not propaganda. The surrender broadcast had been confirmed by multiple sources, and some prisoners had actually heard it. The emperor's voice, transmitted over radio in formal court Japanese, speaking of enduring the unendurable and bearing the unbearable. The war was over. Japan had lost. The soldier sat in the barracks that night, unable to sleep, trying to process what this meant. He had survived. His family, if they were alive, might survive. Japan would be occupied, subjugated, transformed into something unrecognizable. The America he had been taught to hate, the America he had fought for 3 years, would reshape his homeland, and there was nothing he could do but wait and watch and try to understand. Other prisoners reacted differently. Some celebrated quietly, relieved that the killing was over, that they would not be required to fight again. Others despaired, overcome by shame at having survived when so many had died, at having surrendered when the code demanded death. A few attempted suicide that night, cutting their wrists with sharpened metal or hanging themselves with bedsheets. American guards discovered most of them in time, summoning medics who saved lives that the prisoners no longer wanted. The camp commander, an army colonel who had fought in Europe before being transferred to the Pacific, addressed the prisoners the next morning through interpreters. He spoke of the end of the war, of the emperor's surrender, of the occupation that would follow. He assured the prisoners that they would be treated fairly, that they would be repatriated to Japan as soon as transportation could be arranged, that in the meantime, they would continue to be fed and housed and cared for. And then he said something that stunned the assembled prisoners into silence. "You fought bravely for your country. The war is over. But that does not erase your service or your sacrifice. You will be treated with the respect due to soldiers, not criminals." The soldier heard these words through the haze of translation and felt something shift inside him, not gratitude, not relief, but a kind of existential vertigo. The enemy respected him. The enemy fed him. The enemy treated him as though his service had meant something, as though the war had been a contest between equals rather than a crusade against evil. This was not the narrative he had been taught. The Americans were supposed to be racist barbarians who viewed all Asians as subhuman. Yet, here they were, acknowledging his sacrifice, offering respect. The contradiction was irreconcilable. The narrative had been a lie. Everything had been a lie. And the meal sitting in his stomach, meatloaf and mashed potatoes and canned peaches, was the proof. The repatriation began in December 1945, as transport ships became available, and the logistics of returning hundreds of thousands of prisoners to Japan were organized. The soldier boarded a Liberty ship in Manila Harbor along with 2,000 other prisoners, crammed into holds that had once carried tanks and artillery. The conditions were crowded but not cruel. They were fed twice a day, rice and canned vegetables, a concession to Japanese dietary preferences. Though the rice was American-grown, California short grain, and the vegetables were canned by American companies. The voyage to Japan took 8 days. The soldier spent most of it on deck, staring at the ocean, trying to imagine what he would find when he arrived. Yokohama, the port city where they would disembark, had been bombed extensively. His home city of Osaka had been firebombed. His family's neighborhood might not exist anymore. His parents might be dead. His younger brother, conscripted in 1944, was almost certainly dead. The casualty rates for soldiers inducted in the final year of the war approached 90%. He thought about the food he had eaten in the POW camp, the impossible abundance that had broken something inside him. He thought about what it meant that the enemy had so much that waste was inevitable, that even generosity was cheap. He thought about Japan, devastated and starving, its cities in ruins, its people facing occupation by the same enemy that had fed him meatloaf and canned peaches. The ship docked in Yokohama on a gray morning in mid-December. The prisoners were processed through a reception center, their names recorded, their health assessed, and then they were released, turned loose into a Japan they no longer recognized. The soldier walked through the streets of Yokohama, or what remained of them, past buildings reduced to rubble, past crowds of homeless refugees living in makeshift shelters, past children begging for food, with the hollow eyes of starvation. He had eaten that morning a final meal provided by the Americans before disembarkation, rice and miso soup and dried fish. It was the last good meal he would eat for months. In Japan, food was scarce, rationed with brutal efficiency, and even the rations were insufficient. The black market thrived, but prices were beyond the reach of ordinary people. Starvation was not immediate, but it was constant. a background hum of hunger that defined daily life. The contrast to the POW camp was shattering. The soldier had been a prisoner of the enemy, and the enemy had fed him better than his own nation could now feed its citizens. The irony was cruel and inescapable. He made his way to Osaka, traveling by freight train and on foot through a landscape of devastation. The city of his birth was unrecognizable. The firebombing of March 1945 had destroyed more than half the urban area. His family's neighborhood had been incinerated. He found his mother and sister living in a refugee camp on the outskirts of the city, in a shelter made of scavenged wood and corrugated metal. His father was dead, killed in an air raid. His brother had died on Okinawa. His mother wept when she saw him, not with joy but with relief that at least one of her children had survived. She was thin, her face gaunt, her hands rough from labor. His sister, 14 years old, looked like an old woman. They were hungry, perpetually hungry, subsisting on rations of rice mixed with barley and sweet potato, supplemented by whatever they could forage or buy on the black market. The soldier gave them the small amount of money he had been paid by the Americans for his labor in the camp. It was not much, but it bought a few days of slightly better food. He did not tell them about the meals in the camp. He did not tell them about the meatloaf, the mashed potatoes, the canned peaches. How could he? How could he explain that he had eaten better as a prisoner than they had as citizens, that the enemy had been more generous than their own government? He found work eventually. Day labor in the reconstruction effort that was slowly, painfully beginning under American occupation. The work was hard and the pay meager, but it was enough to survive. He ate sparingly, saving what he could for his mother and sister. He avoided other veterans, unable to bear their company, unable to share the experiences that had broken him. But every morning, when he boiled water for tea, not real tea, but roasted barley that approximated the taste, he remembered the coffee. Real coffee, brewed from beans, served in a tin cup by an enemy that had defeated him not through cruelty, but through abundance. He remembered the taste, the warmth, the impossible luxury of it, and he understood, with the clarity that comes from hindsight, that Japan had lost the war before it had begun, because you cannot defeat a nation that has so much it can afford to be generous to its enemies. In the years that followed, as Japan rebuilt under American occupation, and then as an independent nation, the veterans' memories of the POW camp would take on a different character. The immediate trauma faded, replaced by a more complex mixture of gratitude, shame, and philosophical reflection. The occupation, which many Japanese had feared would be brutal, was instead marked by the same pragmatic generosity he had experienced in the camp. The Americans brought food, millions of tons of wheat, rice, and canned goods distributed through relief programs that prevented mass starvation. They brought medicine, infrastructure investment, and the beginnings of democratic reform. The Marshall Plan did not extend to Japan, but American aid did, rebuilding factories and ports, providing loans and technical assistance, transforming the defeated enemy into an economic ally. The same abundance that had won the war now won the peace, because America could afford to rebuild what it had destroyed, and in rebuilding, created markets for American goods and a bulwark against Soviet influence in Asia. The veteran watched this transformation with a kind of weary understanding. Abundance, he had learned, was power. Not the power of weapons or ideology, but the power to shape the world through material reality. Japan had sought power through conquest and had found only ruin. America possessed power through production and had used it to achieve what conquest never could: a lasting peace built on mutual prosperity. He never forgot the meals in the POW camp. They remained with him as a symbol, not just of American abundance, but of the gulf that had existed between the two nations from the beginning. Japan had gone to war to secure rice and oil and rubber, resources it needed to survive and could not obtain through trade because Western powers, America among them, had cut off access through embargoes and sanctions. The war had been, in one sense, a war of scarcity. Japan fighting for the resources to feed its people and fuel its industry. America, by contrast, had fought from abundance. It had not needed to conquer, to survive. It had chosen to fight, and having chosen, had applied the full weight of its industrial and agricultural capacity to ensure victory. The outcome had never been in doubt, not really. Not once the initial Japanese advantages in training and positioning had been eroded by the sheer weight of American material superiority. The meatloaf, the mashed potatoes, the canned peaches, these were not just food. They were symbols of a fundamental difference in national capacity, a difference so vast that no amount of courage or sacrifice could overcome it. The Japanese soldier had been brave. The Japanese military had been skilled and determined. But bravery and skill could not manufacture food from thin air, could not build factories that had been bombed, could not replace ships that had been sunk. The mathematics of war had been against Japan from the beginning, and the meal in the mess hall had been the moment when the mathematics became undeniable. What does it mean when a prisoner is fed better than a soldier? When the defeated are treated with more generosity than the victors show their own citizens. It means that the war was never a contest between equals, that one side possessed advantages so overwhelming that even compassion toward enemies was affordable. The Japanese POWs who passed through American mess halls in the final months of the war and the years of occupation that followed all carried similar stories, stories of cognitive dissonance, of meals so abundant they seemed surreal, of abundance that shattered the propaganda they had believed and forced a reckoning with reality. These stories, told quietly in the decades after the war, formed a counter-narrative to the official histories of heroism and sacrifice. They were stories of hunger and its opposite, of the material conditions that shaped ideology and determined outcomes. The American mess hall meal was not an act of mercy. It was simply what America did fed people, because it could, because abundance made generosity cheap, because the logistical apparatus that had won the war continued to function even after the fighting stopped. And in that casual, unremarkable generosity lay a power more profound than any weapon. The power to redefine reality, to replace one narrative with another, to demonstrate through material fact that the world was not what the defeated had been told it was. The soldier grew old in the new Japan, a Japan that became wealthy in its own right, a Japan that learned to compete in the global economy America had shaped and dominated. He watched his nation transform from devastation to prosperity, from occupied territory to economic powerhouse. He ate well in his later years, better than he had eaten as a young man before the war. But he never forgot the taste of that first meal in the American mess hall, the impossible luxury of meatloaf and mashed potatoes and canned peaches. It was the taste of defeat, yes, but it was also the taste of a truth he had not been taught and could not have imagined. That abundance, not scarcity, was the natural state of the world when nations chose cooperation over conquest, when resources were distributed through trade rather than seized through war. It was the taste of a future his generation had tried to destroy and the next generation would build. In the end, the meal was not about food. It was about everything else. It was about the systems that produced abundance and the systems that produced scarcity. It was about the choices nations made and the consequences that followed. It was about the terrible, simple fact that you cannot win a war against an enemy that can afford to feed you better than your own nation ever did. And it was about the lesson learned too late by men who had fought for an empire that promised greatness and delivered only hunger. That power, real power, comes not from the willingness to die but from the capacity to live and to let others live in a world where there is enough for everyone. The American mess hall meal destroyed the Japanese soldier not because it was cruel but because it was kind. And kindness, backed by the inexhaustible resources of a continent untouched by war, was a weapon against which no ideology could stand.